When did our ancestors become enslaved in Egypt? Next week, we will read in Parshat Shemot how a new king arose over Egypt who didn't know Yosef, and how, out of his fear of the Israelites, he began to oppress them. Perhaps that was the moment that our ancestors became slaves. Or perhaps it happened slightly earlier, after the death of Yosef, when they no longer had someone to protect them and advocate for them in the Egyptian court. We know from more recent history in the Middle Ages and later that very often the death of a powerful member of the Jewish community who had a position in court was an occasion of tragedy in terms of the entire community's loss of security. But I think that our ancestors actually became enslaved much earlier than that. This week in Parshat Vayechi, we read about how after the death of Yaakov, Yosef's brothers, who had been living in Egypt under his protection at that point for 17 years, began to get worried. They feared that perhaps Yosef had been kind to them thus far only for their father's sake, and that with Yaakov now gone, their powerful brother would finally take his much delayed revenge against them for having sold him into slavery. And so the brothers go to Yosef, claiming that their father asked them to ask him to forgive them for the sin of the servants of the God of your father. Lefesha avdei Elokei avicha. So even as they're spinning this fabrication, and not a terribly believable one, because if Yaakov wanted Yosef to forgive the brothers, presumably he would have told Yosef that, not the brothers. But they do manage to do something that might have impressed Yosef more favorably, which is they acknowledge that what they did was a sin. And in doing so, they also define themselves as servants, slaves, the Hebrew word is the same, of the Holy One, blessed is He. Avdei Elokei avicha. We are servants, slaves of the God of your father. Brothers are defining themselves as people who serve God. However, the very next moment, the brothers, perhaps waiting for an answer from Yosef in response that they don't get, we don't hear Yosef responding, "Of course I forgive you." So the brothers go on. They keep talking. And perhaps sensing that Yosef may suspect their story, suspect that this isn't exactly what happened. Yaakov never told them to tell him this. They immediately start talking again and throw themselves on his mercy, declaring, "Hinenu l'cha la'avodim." Behold, we are your servants or slaves. In the space of 2 verses, the brothers go from declaring themselves servants of God, slaves of God, to declaring them slaves of their brother Yosef. Well, which is it? I don't think it can be both. By employing the same word in two consecutive verses to describe first their relationship to God and then their relationship to their brother Yosef, the brothers are giving us a clue as to their mental state. They want to be servants of God. They think of themselves as servants of God. But at the first hint of danger, they panic and throw themselves not on God's protection, but on the mercy of a human master, their brother Yosef, going so far as to declare themselves his slaves in the hope that that will buy them his protection. Now, Yosef responded to this by saying, "Am I in place of God?" And this response is often read as a refusal to pass judgment. Judgment is the pure view of God. God is the one true judge. So, am I in place of God? Who am I to judge your behavior? Yosef is not exactly, if not exactly forgiving, then simply saying it's not my place to pass judgment on you. However, I read in Yosef's statement a rebuke of his brothers' willingness to declare themselves his slave, a criticism of their rhetoric. They just said they're servants of God, and now they're saying they're going to be his servants? By saying, "Am I in place of God?" Yosef is highlighting the contradiction in their own language. And also implying that anytime we choose to serve a human master, we are committing an act somewhat akin to idolatry. Because, like idolatry, choosing to serve a human master means putting our trust and our loyalty in the hands of someone or something that is not God, when in truth, our loyalty, our trust belongs to God. The brothers might have been acting appropriately. They were acting appropriately when they acknowledged their sin to Yosef and asked him to forgive them. Could they have done it maybe a little more straightforwardly without the deception? Maybe. But when they declared themselves his slaves, they went a step too far. Though the text does not say this explicitly, I believe that this was the moment that our ancestors became slaves in Egypt. Until that moment, the brothers and their children had been living in Goshen as guests of Yosef and Pharaoh. But the moment that, acting out of fear, they declared themselves slaves to Yosef, they actually made themselves into slaves. Not to Yosef, but to Pharaoh. Because after all, Yosef himself was a slave to Pharaoh. And the property of a slave belongs to the owner of that slave. So when the brothers said, "We're your slaves," well, to Yosef, Yosef's a slave to Pharaoh. So the brother, through a transitive property of slavery, are now slaves to Pharaoh. Whether they meant to or not, the brothers in this moment became enslaved. There's an irony here, because this whole conversation came out of the fact that the brothers feared that Yosef was going to take revenge against them for having enslaved him. And in their desire to avoid the consequences of their actions, the brothers actually brought about a fitting punishment, midah keneged midah, measure for measure, for what they had done. They had enslaved Yosef, and now in their panic over what he might do, now that he's the one with more power than them, they enslave themselves to him, hoisting themselves on their own petard. Even if we don't think that the brothers' statement had any practical legal effect, if you don't buy my argument that they were actually legally enslaved to Pharaoh at that moment, by choosing to employ this rhetoric of, behold, we are your slaves, the brothers were demonstrating the fact that they put their trust and reliance not on God, but on Yosef. And that in doing so, they were willing to buy security at the price of freedom. The enslavement in Egypt was both a natural outcome and a fitting punishment for our ancestors' willingness to substitute the protection of a human master, their brother Yosef, for the protection of the master of the universe. Lest we judge our ancestors too harshly, we should acknowledge that this is a trade-off that we all make on a daily basis. We all face moments when we have to choose between serving human masters and serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed is He. We all have moments when we're tempted to ignore what we know God wants from us, to what we know is right. What the divine spark inside of us tells us is imperative. Because we're afraid of the consequences. We're afraid of what people will think, or we're afraid of what it'll mean for our position in the community and society, what it'll mean for our ability to get ahead in this world. We all at times, all of us, make the mistake of believing that our well-being depends on earthly powers, be they a job, a community, a politician, an employer, or simply the good opinion of people whose approval we crave. When we make our well-being and happiness dependent on other human beings and the institutions that they build, instead of on our Creator, we, like Joseph's brothers, are condemning ourselves to a life of servitude. However, when we can remember that true security and happiness depend not on earthly powers, but on the power that formed the universe, then no matter our place in society, we are spiritually free. Shabbat, which is rapidly approaching, is our weekly opportunity to take a step back from the business of life and to remind ourselves of this important truth. We spend 6 days working and doing and very often serving human masters. And then on the 7th day, we rest to remind ourselves that the only true master above us is the one on whom all our well-being depends, is the one who worked for 6 days to create this universe, to create all of the things that we think our well-being depends on, and then who rested on the 7th day. May this Shabbat provide us a foretaste of that day. May it come soon. May it come in our lifetimes, when all earthly fetters are loosed, when all peoples are freed from the subjugation of other human beings, and when the entire world can experience the complete Shabbos of recognizing that there is only one master. Shabbat Shalom.